Section 16 of Gray's Anatomy Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.L. Cohen. Anatomy of the Human Body Part 4 by Henry Gray. The Fore-brain Part 4. The hippocampus major, is a curved eminence about 5 centimeters long, which extends throughout the entire length of the floor of the inferior cornu. Its lower end is enlarged and presents 2 or 3 rounded elevations or digitations, which give it a paw-like appearance, and hence it is named a pes hippocampi. If a transverse section be made through the hippocampus, it will be seen that this eminence is produced by the folding of the wall of the hemisphere to form the hippocampal fissure. The main mass of the hippocampus consists of gray substance, but on its ventricular surface is a thin white layer, the alveus, which is continuous with the fimbria hippocampi. The collateral eminence, eminentia collateralis, is an elongated swelling lying lateral and parallel with the hippocampus. It corresponds with the middle part of the collateral fissure, and its size depends on the depth and direction of this fissure. It is continuous behind with a flattened triangular area, the trigonum collaterale, situated between the posterior and inferior cornua. The fimbria hippocampi is a continuation of the crus of the fornix, and will be discussed with that body. A description of the choroid plexus will be found later. The corpus striatum has received its name from the striped appearance which a section of its anterior part presents, in consequence of diverging white fibers being mixed with the gray substance which forms its chief mass. A part of the corpus striatum is embedded in the white substance of the hemisphere, and is therefore external to the ventricle. It is termed the extraventricular portion, or the lentiform nucleus. The remainder, however, projects into the ventricle and is named the interventricular portion, or the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus, nucleus caudatum, is a pear-shaped, highly arched gray mass. Its broad extremity or head is directed forward into the anterior cornu of the lateral ventricle, and is continuous with the anterior perforated substance and with the anterior end of the lentiform nucleus. Its narrow end, or tail, is directed backwards on the lateral side of the thalamus, from which it is separated by the stria terminalis and the terminal vein. It is then continued downward into the roof of the inferior cornu and ends in the nucleus amygdalae at the apex of the temporal lobe. It is covered by the lining of the ventricle and crossed by some veins of considerable size. It is separated from the lentiform nucleus in its greater part of its extent by a thick lamina of white substance called the internal capsule, but the 2 portions of the corpus striatum are united in front. The lentiform nucleus. Nucleus lentiformis, lenticular nucleus lenticula, is lateral to the caudate nucleus and thalamus, and is seen only in sections of the hemisphere. When divided horizontally, it exhibits to some extent the appearance of a biconvex lens, while a coronal section of its central part presents a somewhat triangular outline. It is shorter than the caudate nucleus and does not extend as far forward. It is bounded laterally by a lamina of white substance called the external capsule, and lateral to this is a thin layer of gray substance termed the claustrum. Its anterior end is continuous with the lower part of the head of the caudate nucleus and with the anterior perforated substance. In a coronal section through the middle of the lentiform nucleus, 2 medullary laminae are seen dividing it into 3 parts. The lateral and largest part is of a reddish color and is known as the putamen, while the medial and intermediate area of a yellowish tint, and together constitute the globus pallidus. All 3 are marked by fine radiating white fibers, which are most distinct in the putamen. The gray substance of the corpus striatum is traversed by nerve fibers, some of which originate in it. The cells are multipolar, both large and small. Those of the lentiform nucleus contain yellow pigment. The caudate and lentiform nuclei are not only directly continuous with each other anteriorly, but are connected to each other by numerous fibers. The corpus striatum is also connected, 1, to the cerebral cortex by what are termed corticostriate fibers, 2, to the thalamus by fibers which pass through the internal capsule and by a strand named ansa lentiformis, 3, to the cerebral peduncle by fibers which leave the lower aspect of the caudate and lentiform nuclei. The claustrum is a thin layer of gray substance situated on the lateral surface of the external capsule. Its transverse section is triangular, with the apex directed upward. Its medial surface, contiguous to the external capsule, is smooth, but its lateral surface presents ridges and furrows corresponding with the gyri and sulci of the insula, with which it is in close relationship. The claustrum is regarded as a detached portion of the gray substance of the insula, from which it is separated by a layer of white fibers, the capsula extrema, band of Ballarger. Its cells are small and spindle-shaped and contain yellowish pigment. They are similar to those of the deepest layer of the cortex. The nucleus amygdalae, amygdala, is an ovoid gray mass situated at the lower end of the roof of the inferior cornu. It is merely a localized thickening of the gray cortex, continuous with that of the uncus. In front, it is continuous with the putamen, behind with the stria terminalis and tail of the caudate nucleus. The internal capsule, capsula interna, is a flattened band of white fibers between the lentiform nucleus on the lateral side and the caudate nucleus and thalamus on the medial side. In horizontal section, it is seen to be somewhat abruptly curved with its convexity inward. The prominence of the curve is called the genu and projects between the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. The portion in front of the genu is termed the frontal part and separates the lentiform from the caudate nucleus. The portion behind the genu is the occipital part and separates the lentiform nucleus from the thalamus. The front part of the internal capsule contains 1. Fibers running from the thalamus to the frontal lobe, 2. Fibers connected to lentiform and caudate nuclei, 3. Fibers connecting the cortex with the corpus striatum, and 4. Fibers passing from the frontal lobe through the medial fifth of the base of the cerebral peduncle to the nucleus pontus. The fibers in the region of the genu are named the geniculate fibers. They originate in the motor part of the cerebral cortex, and after passing downward through the base of the cerebral peduncle with the cerebrospinal fibers, undergo decussation and end in the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves of the opposite side. The anterior two-thirds of the occipital part of the internal capsule contain the cerebrospinal fibers, which arise in the motor area of the cerebral cortex and, passing downward through the middle 3/5 of the base of the cerebral peduncle, are continued into the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. The posterior third of the occipital part contains 1. Sensory fibers largely derived from the thalamus, though some may be continued upward from the medial lemniscus. 2. The fibers of the optic radiation, from the lower visual centers to the cortex of the occipital lobe. 3. Acoustic fibers, from the lateral lemniscus to the temporal lobe. And 4. Fibers which pass from the occipital and temporal lobes to the nuclei pontus. The fibers of the internal capsule radiate widely as they pass to and from the various parts of the cerebral cortex, forming the corona radiata, and intermingling with the fibers of the corpus callosum. The external capsule, capsula externa, is a lamina of white substance situated lateral to the lentiform nucleus, between it and the claustrum, and continuous with the internal capsule below and behind the lentiform nucleus. It probably contained fibers derived from the thalamus, the anterior commissure, and the subthalamic region. The substantia innominata of Meinert is a stratum consisting partly of gray and partly of white substance, which lies below the anterior part of the thalamus and lentiform nucleus. It consists of 3 layers, superior, middle, and inferior. The superior layer is named the ansa lentiformis, and its fibers, derived from the medullary lamina of the lentiform nucleus, pass medially to end in the thalamus and subthalamic region, while others are said to end in the tegmentum and red nucleus. The middle layer consists of nerve cells and nerve fibers. Fibers enter it from the parietal lobe through the external capsule, while others are said to connect it with the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The inferior layer forms the main part of the inferior stalk of the thalamus and connects this body with the temporal lobe and insula. The stria terminalis, Taenia semicircularis, is a narrow band of white substance situated in the depression between the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Anteriorly, its fibers are partly continued into the column of the fornix. Some, however, pass over the anterior commissure to the gray substance between the caudate nucleus and the septum pellucidum, while others are said to enter the caudate nucleus. Posteriorly, it is continued into the roof of the inferior cornu of the lateral ventricle, at the extremity of which it enters the nucleus amygdalae. Superficial to it is a large vein, the terminal vein, vein of the corpus striatum, which receives numerous tributaries from the corpus striatum and thalamus. It runs forward to the interventricular foramen and there joins with the vein of the choroid plexus to form the corresponding internal cerebral vein. On the surface of the terminal vein is a narrow white band named the lamina affixa. The fornix is a longitudinal arch-shaped lamella of white substance situated below the corpus callosum and continuous with it behind, but separated from it in front by the septum pellucidum. It may be described as consisting of 2 symmetrical bands, one for either hemisphere. The 2 portions are not united